My parents said my business belonged to the family and tried to take it, so I stayed quiet, took action, and what happened next shattered everything. I'm a 28-year-old guy, and I started my own e-commerce business about 5 years ago. I built it from scratch, and it's honestly something I'm pretty proud of. But now, I'm dealing with something I never expected. My parents are insisting that my business should be the family's legacy. It all started after I moved out at 18. I didn't exactly have an easy start. My family didn't help me financially, which was fine because they weren't exactly rolling in money either, but it was clear to me early on that if I wanted something I'd have to get it myself. So, that's what I did. I saved every bit I could from odd jobs, and once I felt like I had a solid plan, I took out loans and worked long nights. There were a lot of months I barely made rent, let alone had enough left over for anything else. But gradually, things started picking up, and the business grew. My parents always encouraged family loyalty, saying things like, "Family's all we've got," or "No matter what, family sticks together." But they never helped with the actual work. As my business started to take off, they'd come by occasionally, usually just to check in and offer advice that didn't really help. Things like, "You should try adding more products," or "People love free shipping," as if I hadn't already thought of that stuff. It was harmless at first, kind of annoying, sure, but nothing that bothered me too much. Then, a few weeks ago, we had a family gathering. My parents had invited a bunch of family friends and extended relatives, and at one point, out of nowhere, they started talking about how the business was going to be the family legacy. They said it with this tone, like it was a given fact. I kind of laughed it off, thinking they were just being overly proud or something. But when I looked at their faces, I realized they were completely serious. Later, when everyone else was out of earshot, my parents cornered me in the kitchen. They went on about how they expected the business to stay in the family, and that naturally it should pass down to them. Their reasoning? Family should always come first. They actually seemed to think I'd just hand it over to them one day. I was shocked, to be honest. I told them that, respectfully, this business wasn't a family thing, it was mine. I had put in all the work, all the late nights, all the financial risk, and they hadn't been involved at any point. I wasn't rude, just straightforward, figuring they'd understand if I explained it that way. But that only seemed to make things worse. My mom went off about how they'd sacrificed so much for me growing up, that it was only fair they benefit from the success of the business. I tried to tell them that starting the business had nothing to do with them, but they didn't want to hear it. My dad just kept saying, "After all we've done, you think we don't deserve this?" They were using words like deserve and owed, which felt like I was suddenly talking to strangers. Then they started bringing this up to other family members. At the next family dinner, they casually mentioned how well the business was doing, but with a twist, making it sound like I was just waiting to share the wealth with everyone. One of my uncles even asked me if it was true that I'd be keeping it in the family. It was clear my parents had been sharing this idea around, and everyone now assumed I was on board with this legacy plan. What really threw me off was when they started talking about the business's value in front of the extended family. I had never discussed financial details with them, but somehow they had figured out or guessed the ballpark number. It made things awkward because suddenly everyone in the family knew roughly how well the business was doing, which I had been keeping private for a reason. After that gathering, I decided I couldn't keep brushing it off. I had to take a stand. I told them point blank that I wasn't planning on handing it over. I figured being upfront would be enough, but it wasn't. They got defensive, going on about how much they'd sacrificed for me growing up. They kept saying that if it weren't for them, I wouldn't be where I am, which felt like guilt tripping. Things got even messier when my parents started calling other relatives to tell their side of the story. Suddenly, everyone was hearing about how ungrateful I was for not giving back to the family. I was frustrated, but I tried to keep things calm. I kept explaining that the business was something I built independently, not a family asset, but it didn't seem to matter to them. Seeing things spiral like this, I realized I might be in for a bigger fight than I thought. It started feeling like they weren't going to let it go anytime soon, and the whole family seemed to be getting involved one way or another. So I decided to get some outside perspective, and that's when I posted about it on Reddit. I needed advice on how to handle what was turning into a full-blown family entitlement situation, and I figured if anyone would understand, it would be people who've gone through similar drama. And that's where things really started to escalate. The next family dinner was set up almost like an ambush. My parents invited me, saying they wanted to catch up and enjoy a meal together. I didn't think much of it, just a typical family dinner. When I arrived, though, I realized the gathering was a bit more crowded than I'd expected. My siblings were there, along with some aunts, uncles, and even a couple of cousins I hadn't seen in a while. As the evening went on, I started picking up on this strange energy. People kept bringing up little stories about my childhood, mostly about how hard my parents had worked to raise me. Every few minutes, someone would casually bring up a sacrifice they made, like skipping vacations or taking on extra hours at work. It wasn't long before I realized what this was turning into, a subtle way to hammer in how much I owed my parents. Eventually, my dad brought it up directly. He turned to me, saying something about how my success was a result of the strong values they'd instilled in me. My mom joined in, explaining that without their sacrifices, I wouldn't be in the position I am today. They kept saying that it only made sense for me to honor the family by keeping the business in the family. I started to understand that this wasn't just a dinner, it was an intervention. I tried to stay calm and explain that, while I appreciated everything they'd done for me, my business was built on my own work and the risks I'd taken alone. I offered to help them in other ways. I could set up monthly financial support or create a fund for them, just something that didn't involve giving up control of my business. I thought this might be a reasonable compromise, but they didn't want to hear it. My parents brushed off the idea of support, insisting that the business itself was worth more than some allowance and that it had to stay in the family. They talked about it like it was some sacred family heirloom, even though they hadn't had any involvement in building it. They were making it clear they saw it as theirs by right. Then my siblings joined in. They started agreeing with my parents, saying it was only fair for them to inherit it. They brought up how they also missed out on things because of my parents' sacrifices, and suggested that this was a way for the family to share in my success. Suddenly, I was facing down a whole room full of people who seemed to think my business belonged to them. It got even worse when my parents took things public, in front of everyone. They started listing all the things they had sacrificed to raise me, the things they never had for themselves so I could have a future. My aunts and uncles nodded along, and it was clear they thought I should be grateful. And apparently, grateful meant giving up control of my own business. One by one, they started throwing out these little comments about how I'd been given so much, and how it was time for me to give back. They brought up things I hadn't thought about in years, using every little moment they'd helped me as leverage to make me reconsider. I finally hit my breaking point. I explained to the whole room, as calmly as I could, that my business was not a family project. I'd started it on my own, taken all the risks, and invested my own money. They weren't entitled to anything. I thought this would clear things up, but instead, it just made everything worse. My parents started accusing me of putting money over family, calling me selfish right there in front of everyone. The rest of the family seemed stunned by my parents' approach, but no one stepped in to support me. It was like they didn't know what to say or whose side to take, so they stayed quiet. But that silence made things even harder. I felt completely alone in the room. After that, my parents started reaching out to other relatives, spreading this narrative that I was cutting them out and refusing to help the family. Soon, I started getting messages from extended family members asking why I was treating my parents like strangers. Some of them seemed genuinely confused, others sounded disappointed, and a few outright scolded me for forgetting my roots. And then, as if that wasn't enough, I started hearing from friends. Apparently, my parents had been talking to anyone who would listen, portraying me as this cold, materialistic person who was too focused on money to care about his family. Friends who hadn't spoken to me in months were suddenly reaching out, asking what was going on, and if I'd really cut off my family. They seemed to believe I was turning my back on the people who'd raised me. At this point, I was starting to feel like there was no one left who understood my side. It was like the whole world had suddenly decided that I was wrong. I realized then that I might need to do more than just explain myself. I might actually need legal documentation to protect my business, just in case things went any further. After the family dinner turned intervention, I realized things were heading into dangerous territory. I decided to get legal advice, just to be safe. I reached out to a lawyer, explained the situation, and asked what I could do to protect the business if my parents tried to make any claims. My lawyer listened, didn't seem too surprised. Apparently this type of family entitlement wasn't uncommon, and reassured me that I could set things up to make sure my parents had no legal grounds. Just as I was starting to feel a bit of relief from having a plan, I got an angry message from my mom. She'd found out I was consulting a lawyer. I don't know how. It could have been a sibling, or maybe one of my relatives had seen me near the lawyer's office. Either way, my parents took it as a betrayal. They called it a slap in the face that I would go behind their backs and get the law involved, which to them meant I was planning to cut them out officially. Things escalated fast. Not long after the first call, my parents demanded that I legally recognize them as part owners of the business. They sent me a message saying they deserved to be listed on the business documents with specific ownership rights. It wasn't a request, it was a demand. I couldn't believe they were actually trying to go this far. When I refused, they took it up another level, saying they would pursue legal action if I didn't comply. They claimed that, as family, they had a right to a portion of the business, especially since, according to them, it was built on their sacrifices. To make matters worse, my sibling jumped on their side, saying that they'd always supported me and I owed the family for any success I'd had. That's when the extended family fallout started. Family members began reaching out, some clearly upset, others trying to stay neutral. But with each message, it was obvious that people were picking sides. Some relatives even hinted that I should just give in a little to avoid tearing the family apart, while others avoided bringing it up entirely. At family gatherings, people acted tense, as if everyone was trying to keep the peace, but it was clear where people's loyalties lay. The division was real, and it felt like my parents had effectively split the family in two over this. But then a surprising shift happened. Friends who had heard about the situation started reaching out to support me. When they heard the full story, they couldn't believe what my parents were doing. Messages came pouring in, offering words of encouragement, and several even said they'd stand by me if things went public or ugly. I hadn't realized how much support I had until that moment. Meanwhile, my parents took to social media. They began posting vague messages about betrayal and forgetting family values, clearly aimed at me. People in their circle started commenting things like, "Family should come first," or "No one forgets where they came from." The guilt tripping was turning into a public spectacle. After a few days of seeing these posts pop up, I decided to block my parents on social media. It wasn't worth getting dragged into a digital argument, especially since they were using these posts to fuel the family drama. But even blocking them wasn't enough to stop the messages from spreading. Family, friends, and relatives began reaching out, quoting my parents' words about family legacy, and suggesting that maybe I should reconsider. Finally, I decided to make one last attempt at peace. I set up a meeting with my parents, hoping to offer a solution. I told them I could help with their living expenses if they needed it. I even offered to set up a fund they could draw from for retirement or emergencies. Anything that might show them I wasn't abandoning them without giving up the business. But they shut it down instantly. They weren't interested in money or support, they wanted ownership. My mom made it clear they didn't want handouts. They wanted control over the legacy they claimed I owed to them. It didn't stop there. Somehow, even people I barely knew started messaging me. Friends of the family, distant relatives, all repeating the same line, "Family should come first." People who didn't even know the full story were chiming in, urging me to make things right. It was exhausting, like the entire family network was being mobilized against me, all repeating the same idea that family was more important than any individual effort. My lawyer, thankfully, was able to keep things in perspective. After hearing the latest update, he reassured me that the business was safe. I had full legal ownership, and the business structure protected me. My parents, as hard as they were pushing, had no real legal claim to it. But even knowing that, it felt like the battle wasn't ending anytime soon. After my parents made their legal threat and the demands kept coming, I realized it was time to reveal the full story. Up until that point, I'd kept things vague on Reddit, talking mostly about their demands but not the backstory. So, I decided to lay it all out. I shared how I'd started the business on my own, how my parents hadn't supported me financially, and how their involvement had only ever been giving advice on things they didn't understand. I wanted people to see the complete picture, not just the family guilt-tripping tactics they were using. The response was huge. Friends, family, and even some of my parents' friends who had heard about the family legacy story were suddenly shocked. People began reaching out, asking if it was really true that my parents hadn't helped at all in building the business. Extended family members, some of whom had been silent up to this point, started texting and calling me to say they couldn't believe my parents' behavior. I'd been so used to everyone taking my parents' side that this support took me by surprise. But my parents were furious. They found out about the post and went into full damage control mode. My dad's side of the family, in particular, started getting bombarded with messages from my parents, framing me as the one who was lying and turning the family against them. This led to more family members taking sides, and the divide became even more pronounced. Some relatives felt my parents were out of line, while others believed their side of the story, thinking I was the one stirring up drama. It was as if a whole family war had broken out, with everyone choosing a side. Around this time, my parents suggested mediation. They told me they wanted to settle things peacefully with the help of a family lawyer. I recognized it for what it was, a ploy to make it look like they were the reasonable ones. They hinted that if I refused, it would mean I was unwilling to work things out, setting me up to be the bad guy if things got worse. I turned down the mediation offer. I made it clear that this was my business, and there was no reason for mediation over something they had no part in creating. My refusal didn't go over well. My sibling reached out this time, trying to compromise. He suggested that I hand over at least 10% of the business to my parents to keep the peace and satisfy them. When I refused again, he accused me of being the cause of all the division in the family, saying I was selfish for putting my business over family harmony. The longer this dragged on, the more some family members began to distance themselves. The constant back and forth had worn everyone out, and it became obvious that people were getting tired of the drama. Some relatives started ignoring group messages, not showing up for family gatherings, or simply staying out of the discussions. My parents had stirred up a level of tension that most of the family just didn't want to be around. Then came the health angle. My parents began telling everyone that the stress from this situation was affecting their health. They didn't outright blame me, but the message was clear. They wanted people to think that I was putting so much strain on them that it was impacting their well-being. They used this as another tool to get family sympathy, telling everyone they were doing their best to handle things calmly while dealing with their own health issues. It was another tactic, and while some family members saw through it, others bought into it completely. Friends, meanwhile, continued reaching out, confused and trying to piece together what was going on. Some were hesitant, unsure if they'd been misled by my parents' public posts about family values, but the ones who knew the whole story stood by me. I even had some old friends reach out after hearing through mutual connections about what was going on. Each time someone reached out, it was like reliving the situation, with everyone asking why my parents were so fixated on the business. As if things couldn't get worse, a demand letter finally arrived from my parents' lawyer. They were now formally asking for a share in the business. My lawyer reviewed it and assured me that I was protected. The business structure was solid, and they had no legal claim to it. But it didn't make the situation any easier. Knowing I was legally safe didn't erase the emotional toll this whole ordeal was taking. What's more, the extended family finally started to realize that my parents had no actual legal right to the business. Word started spreading that they hadn't contributed financially or in any other way, and some family members who'd been on the fence began distancing themselves from my parents. The reality was out in the open, and a lot of people didn't want to support their entitlement anymore. Still, my siblings doubled down, now blaming me entirely for the broken family. They said that if I had just listened and given in to the initial demands, things wouldn't have gotten this far. The accusations piled up, with them insisting I was tearing the family apart over money. After months of endless drama, I made the decision to go no contact with my family. I blocked my parents and siblings on every platform, from social media to my phone. I informed a few extended family members about my decision to make sure they knew I wasn't open to any more mediation or guilt tripping. It felt strange, but also like something I should have done long ago. I couldn't keep allowing them to push me around, especially when they'd gone as far as dragging lawyers into it. Within days, the backlash started. My parents took to social media, this time with direct posts about how I'd abandoned my family. They shared stories of sacrifices they made for me, claiming I was too focused on money to remember family values. They added pictures from old family gatherings, twisting them into a narrative about how I'd betrayed the people who had raised me. Their friends and even some family members jumped in, commenting how sad it was that family had come to this, with lines like, "Blood is thicker than water," and "family should always come first." They were doing everything they could to paint themselves as the victims. I knew it was only a matter of time before some relatives started calling me, trying to guilt me into fixing things, and sure enough, the messages and voicemails started pouring in, especially from older relatives. I'd get messages saying things like, "You only have one family," or "You'll regret this one day." It felt endless. The more I ignored them, the more intense the messages got, as if everyone was trying to pull me back in. Eventually, I decided to seek out therapy to make sense of everything that had happened. I was worried I was losing perspective or being unreasonable. My therapist listened to my story without judgment, and after a few sessions they assured me that my choice to go no contact wasn't selfish, it was necessary. They pointed out that my family's behavior had crossed lines repeatedly and validated my need for boundaries. For the first time in months, I felt like I had someone on my side who truly understood the situation, but even therapy couldn't stop my parents. They took things a step further, showing up unannounced at my office one afternoon. I was in the middle of a meeting when I got a message from the front desk saying my parents were there demanding to speak with me. They were making a scene, insisting that they had a right to see me because this was about family. The receptionist, who knew a bit about the situation, looked worried. I asked her to call security. Security arrived and escorted my parents out of the building. They left, but not without putting up a fight, insisting loudly that they'd done nothing wrong and were only there to reconnect with their son. By the time they were finally gone, I knew I'd done the right thing setting firm boundaries. This was the final straw, and having security escort them out was a boundary I felt had been long overdue. Over the next few days, friends and colleagues who had seen or heard about the incident reached out with overwhelming support. They assured me I'd made the right call, reinforcing that it was time to let go of anyone who only brought negativity. My lawyer got in touch soon after with some good news. My parents' lawyer had dropped the case. They must have finally understood that their attempts to claim part of my business were never going to work legally. They had no grounds, and without a lawyer pushing their case, they were left with nothing but empty threats. As the dust settled, I noticed a shift within the extended family. Relatives who had initially sided with my parents began to reach out, offering quiet apologies and admitting they'd been unaware of the full story. They said they hadn't realized the extent of my parents' entitlement and were backing off from the issue entirely. It felt like, for once, people were beginning to understand my side of things, or at least choosing to stay out of it. Not everyone backed off, though. My sibling refused to let go, still sending messages whenever they found a way, demanding that I make things right with my parents. They made it clear they blamed me for the family division and even accused me of breaking our parents' hearts. I ignored these messages, deleting them as they came. I knew that responding would only drag me back into the cycle of guilt and manipulation. With no legal threats hanging over me, no guilt-tripping messages I had to respond to, and no family pressure constantly weighing me down, I felt a freedom I hadn't experienced in years. It was like a weight had been lifted, and for the first time, I could finally focus entirely on my business and my own well-being. I poured my energy into growing the business, taking on new projects, and connecting with people who genuinely respected my boundaries. Friends, colleagues, and even some distant relatives who'd heard about everything were supportive, reminding me that sometimes choosing peace meant letting go of people who couldn't respect it. Now, with everything finally behind me, I'm more resolved than ever to protect my peace and focus on my future. My family may never understand my decision, and that's okay. I'm moving forward with no regrets. A few months passed after going no contact, and I started noticing changes in my life I hadn't expected. Without the constant drama, there was this unexpected sense of peace. Work became easier to focus on, and I had time to make plans for the business that I'd been putting off for years. The silence wasn't always easy, though. Estranging myself from family didn't come without moments of doubt, but every time I questioned my decision, I'd remember the endless cycle of guilt and manipulation, and know I'd done the right thing. Therapy had become a major part of my life. My therapist and I dug into years of childhood dynamics, unpacking how my need for approval had pushed me to keep trying with my family long past the point of reason. Realizing how much of my actions had been shaped by a sense of duty and guilt was eye-opening. I started setting healthier boundaries in other areas of my life too. It felt like I was finally building a life based on my own values, not on what anyone else thought I should be doing. Meanwhile, the business had taken off more than I'd anticipated. Without family distractions, I could invest more in expanding, and things were moving fast. I even hired a small team to help manage operations, freeing up time to focus on long-term growth. With the family drama on hold, I could see the full potential of what I'd built, and it felt incredible. Surprisingly, a few extended family members reached out. Some who'd initially sided with my parents apologized. They said they hadn't realized how intense things had gotten, or that my parents were pushing for actual ownership. A couple of them even said they'd support me if my parents tried anything again. I was cautious about opening up too much, but it was refreshing to feel some genuine support from family. The silence from my parents and sibling, however, stayed unbroken until I got a letter. The letter was from my parents, and the tone was completely different from anything they'd written or said before. They claimed they wanted to reconcile and move past everything, expressing regret for any hurtful actions. The letter wasn't dripping with demands, and for once, there were no guilt trips about how much they'd done for me. It was almost apologetic, which was so out of character that I wasn't sure what to make of it. I took the letter to my therapist, who encouraged me to take my time and approach it with caution. Part of me wanted to believe it was genuine, but I couldn't ignore how manipulative they'd been in the past. I decided I wouldn't respond immediately. If they truly wanted to reconcile, they could wait until I was ready. Around that same time, I received a few messages from my sibling. They didn't acknowledge the letter or the attempt at reconciliation. Instead, it was the same old blame game. My sibling accused me of abandoning the family and tearing everyone apart. After reading a couple of those messages, I knew that, whatever happened with my parents, my sibling wasn't ready to let go of the resentment. I was slowly coming to terms with the fact that we might never have a functional relationship. After a lot of thought, I decided to set my own terms for reconciliation with my parents. If they wanted to rebuild a relationship, I needed strict boundaries. I wrote them a letter, outlining my conditions, no discussions about my business, no guilt tripping, and respect for my independence. I made it clear that if these boundaries weren't respected, I'd go back to no contact. I kept it short, respectful, and to the point, giving them a chance to show me they were serious about reconciliation. To my surprise, they agreed. They wrote back, saying they understood my conditions and accepted them fully. They even offered an apology for the entitlement they'd shown, saying they now recognized how it had affected me. The tone was respectful, almost humbled. I still wasn't sure what to believe, but I agreed to meet, this time in a neutral setting. We met at a quiet cafe, and the atmosphere was tense at first. We talked about general things, work, life updates, but they kept away from any questions about my business. They expressed pride in what I'd achieved, which was the first time they'd ever done that without an underlying demand attached. My dad admitted they might have gone too far in their expectations, and for once, they didn't follow it up with any kind of but. It felt surreal. Even though the conversation was polite, I knew I couldn't let my guard down. This one meeting wasn't going to undo years of issues, and I didn't trust that things would stay this way. But it was a start. After we parted ways, I felt cautiously optimistic, aware that any future with them would only work if those boundaries stayed in place. My friends were a solid grounding force through all this. They reminded me that I didn't owe anyone anything, and that it was okay to move slowly, keeping the boundaries firm. Their support helped keep me from getting too wrapped up in the what-if of trying to fix things with my parents. Moving forward, I'm setting clear boundaries for any future relationship with my parents. They won't be getting involved in my business or my personal life beyond what I'm comfortable with, and if those lines get crossed, I'm prepared to walk away again. For now, I'm keeping things light and focused on the present, keeping them out of anything business-related and steering clear of any heavy conversations. I thank the community for their support and for giving me a space to process everything. I knew now that my boundaries were what had made all the difference, allowing me to start building a life where I could thrive. This whole experience taught me that sometimes walking away is the only way to make peace, and if reconciliation does happen, it has to be with respect and self-respect. I've got my life back, and this time, it's on my terms.